What does it mean to say that men have a natural right to liberty?
A lot of the language of the Declaration is so familiar that we actually miss the strangeness of the reasoning behind its thought. We focus in on the words and forget or are ignorant of the long debates that led ultimately to that conclusion being stated as it was in the Declaration. Jefferson claimed that there was no originality of his own in the document, that he was just stating the common sense of the time. But that's falsely modest and not even simply true. The Declaration speaks of natural rights and of our natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where does it come from? That's worth trying to explore and to think about. Ultimately, the understanding of liberty there is inseparable from an understanding of human equality. There's no sense here in the document of what was taken for granted in earlier times. That's to say that there are politically significant differences between human beings, and that those differences would be expressed by institutions that assume that some people are fit to rule and others fit to be ruled. Now, Jefferson is embodying a new wave of thinking that says, to quote a famous statement that he himself quotes, some men are not born with saddles on their backs, and others born with spurs to ride them. There are differences, to be sure, between human beings in all the ways that we recognize and accept today, in terms of sports, musical performance, you name it. But in this respect, all men are equal in the enjoyment of their liberty to live their lives, not at the command of others, but as best they can work them out for themselves.
It's often asserted that Locke is the chief philosophical inspiration for the Declaration. How influential was his thinking?
Well, if you ask, was Locke well read in America in colonial or times or before the Constitution? He was read by a certain small number of people. But it's not clear to me that what they were reading was especially, say, his two treatises on government. They may have been more interested actually in his psychological theory, his essay concerning human understanding. And yet, one does see in the debates having to do with the adoption of a constitution for Massachusetts in 1776 and 1780, there's a very vibrant pamphlet literature that goes on for and against proposed constitutional measures. And you'll have a footnote, Locke on government, okay, without any further specification. So some people were reading Locke, and he was certainly cited a great deal. But so too, for that matter, was Montesquieu and Trenchard and Gordon, writing under the pseudonym of Cato. So there was a certain body of thinking that was leading people away from that old feudal and aristocratic way of thinking to the notion of natural rights and the enjoyment of liberty and a representative government that was truly representative. At the same time, if you think about what became the United States of America in the 1780s, you're talking about a people who had over 120 years of self-government here as colonies, beginning with the Mayflower, Jamestown, and those places. They had worked out some kind of governmental system. in which they essentially adopted notions of governance that Locke provided a philosophic justification for. But that's not to undercut the notion that there was a legacy of British common law, British liberty, painfully won over many centuries, that these people regarded themselves as the heirs to. It was theirs. They were proud of being Britons, of enjoying British liberties. And that's a big part of their background, as well as John Locke.
The colonists often referred not to natural rights, but to their rights and liberties as Englishmen. How does this differ from a natural right to liberty?
Natural rights would suggest you're the owner and possessor of your body, with the exception that Locke makes. That doesn't entitle you to suicide, because in that sense you're only the life tenant of your body. And the English common law and the long accretion of liberties that the English people painfully got through many centuries of struggle for the independence of Parliament and all that. And of course, the Glorious Revolution, the fact that before that, they actually separated a king's head from the shoulders. This didn't just happen. Those embodied what later came to be called natural rights, but something more, something specific to Britain. So you might say, an Englishman's home is his castle. That goes beyond what a natural right would be. Natural rights was the basic core: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And British liberties, or English liberties in the 17th century, were something more that had to do with notions of representation in Parliament, rule of law, accountability. These things are already present in that old English tradition, and they go beyond what natural rights would require.
The committee that drafted the Declaration considered whether to invoke the rights of Englishmen or natural right. What accounts for their decision to recur to natural right?
In making a Declaration of Independence, it's no longer important or necessary to claim the rights of Englishmen. You claim the rights of Englishmen when you regard yourself as part of English society, when you look up to the king as your common sovereign. At this time, they're saying goodbye forever. By the time the Continental Congress has issued the Declaration of Independence, it's goodbye. It's over. There's no longer room or place to appeal to our common rights as Englishmen, because they're not going to be Englishmen anymore. They're setting up a separate nationality. They want to be recognized as such. Less perhaps by the British government, which hasn't been terribly careful to listen to what the colonists were saying, but say, Dutch bankers, we're setting up shop now. And the grounds for our separation are not some debate over what the English or the British Constitution is. The basis for our separation has to do with rights which we as human beings have and enjoy, and we are hereby asserting them.
Could you say more about the difference between an aristocratic regime and a Republican or Democratic regime?
The Declaration of Independence, the events leading up to it, the vast outpouring of paper about the rights and wrongs of all this, are a watershed in world history. Not that the world was paying a special attention at that point, but it's a clear assertion that we're moving into a new age an age where you could not presume, by virtue of your birth, that you were entitled to or condemned to a particular stratum in society. You weren't destined to be where you were born, among the top or among the bottom. Now, who you were was more significant than who your daddy was. You didn't inherit status, but you were in a field where you could make your own way. Show your stuff. The aristocratic order assumed fixed positions. You were born into it, and you would die in it. Whether you were a serf under the Tsar or a peasant under Louis XIV, it's settled. Or if you were an aristocrat in Britain, you couldn't be de-aristocrated. You were there. And here was something new that opened up the possibility for individuals to both rise and fall. I mean, it didn't do away with the question of luck. You still had to be lucky. But it wasn't destined. And that was an enormously exhilarating thought. When that message came out to old Europe, latter part of the 18th century and into the 19th century, all sorts of people who were terribly unhappy in their homeland decided there was a better chance over here. You know, it's a general rule, and I think it's true. Happy people don't emigrate. The people who came to America, I'm leaving aside the people who were brought here, forced here as slaves, that's another issue. But the people who came to America were people who were unhappy where they had been and were looking for something better. And the doctrines of the Declaration, presented as universals, not having to do with our being English or of English descent, but simply as inhering in human beings as such, was a powerful motive, a powerful attractive force that said, come here, there's a different kind of world. That was a huge propaganda victory for a new country at the edge of the civilized world.
Could you tell us about how the ancient understanding of liberty might be different from the modern understanding of liberty?
In thinking about liberty in this modern world, 18th century world that prided itself on its enlightenment and so on, it's helpful to think of a contrast with an older pre-Enlightenment way of thinking. And the text that we have most accessible to us is the Bible. So if you look at the Hebrew Scriptures, which embody also a code of law, unlike the Christian Gospels, you could say the notion of liberty there is to do what the law commands. That's your area of liberty. The law prescribes, and your liberty is to do it. By the mid-17th century, we're getting a different notion of liberty. And I could bring that out from a line from Thomas Hobbes, who's a predecessor of Locke. In his book, The Leviathan, he defines liberty: that which the law hath pretermitted to command, which means in our English, if there ain't a law against it, you can do it. So wherever the law is silent, there's a free field of action and of thought. That's very different from the prescription of the Mosaic Law, and also very different from Aristotle's view of what liberty is. Liberty, he says, is to do what the law commands. So here is a sharp divide in the very understanding of what it means to be a free person. In the old way of thinking, the law makes you free. Your behavior, your actions in conformity with the law constitute your liberation. Your liberation from ignorance, idolatry, stupidity, criminal impulses, what have you. You follow the law and you become a free person. The modern notion is that you're free to do what you will unless there's a law against it. There's another element of this that gets expressed in that strange assertion of natural right, having to do with the pursuit of happiness. We have a right, the Declaration says, not to happiness. They couldn't have guaranteed that anyway. But to pursue it, which means I as an individual, you as an individual, will work out our singular individual notions of what would make us happy, and Declaration says, go for it. Within the bounds, obviously, of not impinging on the other fellow's pursuit of happiness. But there's a broad field for liberty, as we moderns understand it, in the modern conception, which was not present in the old one.
Is there a unifying conception of liberty in the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
The Declaration doesn't prescribe whether it's liberty for something or liberty from something. It's left open in that way. It's as though, well, everybody knows what liberty is. I know it when I feel it. I mean, philosophically, that's not very adequate. But you might say the promise of the Declaration, or the promise of American life as it was understood in those days, as it was imagined in Europe and places like that, was that this was a place where you could be your own man, where you could try to find your own way. And there was nobody standing in your way, forbidding you, but also that there wouldn't be someone who would presume to guide you. So that's an open field full of promise and risks. A lot of people are going to do stupid things and fall on their faces. But as we say, it's a free country, ain't it?
How did the colonists understand the Declaration? Did the Declaration represent an American mind, as Jefferson later said, or were there rival understandings?
The Declaration has a strange and complicated history. It created a situation in this country of great embarrassment about conditions that didn't embarrass people in other countries. By asserting these natural rights, by holding forth this notion of liberty, and all men are created equal, and so on, in the enjoyment of those rights, it drew unremitting attention to the gross inequalities in American life, and above all, that having to do with what used to be called Negro chattel slavery. Other countries had slavery, serfdom, indentured servitude, gross inequalities, and they lived with it. In America, it was a standing affront to the principles on which the country was founded and which it paraded before the world. This is who we are. So it wasn't just a question of hypocrisy, though hypocrisy was charged against the Americans by the British and others. But it was a form of internal anguish and uncertainty. How can we say this on the one hand and have this on the other? It's really convenient to have slaves if you're a master. But it made the principles of the Declaration a lie as far as their realization in life. Now, when slavery became really profitable after the invention of the cotton gin, and there was a profitable market in breeding slaves in the eastern southern states and shipping them west to work the new lands that were opening up as the frontier moved westward. The argument came up that we shouldn't be embarrassed by the Declaration because its assertion of its principles that all men are created equal and so on was, and I'm quoting, a self-evident lie, not a self-evident truth. So you could say, not everyone was singing Hosanna and praise for the Declaration as this country moved into the 19th century and for considerable time thereafter. It took a powerful, both rhetorically and philosophically, powerful counterstatement and campaign by Abraham Lincoln to, so to speak, remind us people what we're supposed to be about. So the Declaration moved from being an embarrassment to a challenge. And how Lincoln did that is another story.
There are many people who have said that natural rights are a myth. How do you respond to that claim?
I don't understand, and it's a failure of my imagination, the argument that says that natural rights, or the assertion of natural rights, is a myth. Consent of the governed is a myth. Equality is a myth. These are principles that we hold up as ideals and that strike us as profoundly right, as profoundly true, as profoundly liberating and ennobling. Philosophers talked about the social contract. Well, nobody could find a piece of paper going back, into antiquity, where men first came into association and all signed on the dotted line. There is no Mayflower Compact at the time that Rome was established or anything like that. And yet, these are efforts to try to understand how individuals off by themselves in some primitive woods ever got together enough, not just to breed and multiply, but to form some kind of collective life for themselves. On what terms would people enter into that kind of an arrangement? What would be their conditions, assuming that they weren't simply conquered, and enslaved? So you could say people wouldn't, almost any reasonably sane human being, I'm not talking about educated, just compos mentis, nobody would enter into a deal where he put himself at the mercy of someone else without any qualification, without any resort, if things got really bad, to withdraw or to fight it. So, you don't have to know, you don't have to have an advanced degree from a university to know that somebody's stomping on you. I mean, most people are not so stupid. And they were looking for ways of explaining how it is that I give myself to a community, which cramps my style in some respect, but I don't give myself unqualifiedly. And they're looking in this way to make sense of the terms under which they agree to follow rules that may not be entirely to their liking. I mean, even the notion of majority rule, 50% plus one. That doesn't mean that the 50% plus one, they're the voice of God. They can be mistaken, and very often are. But we understand there are rules we follow so that we're not kids on a school playground. I don't like the way you're playing, I'm going to take my marbles and go home. We don't do that. It's a convention. It's a man-made arrangement which makes sense.
Could you say more about Locke's concept of a state of nature and its relationship to liberty?
People often talk about Locke's influence through his concept of the state of nature and the movement to civil society. I think it's important to puzzle a bit over the very notion of a state of nature. Where do we hear of a state of nature before? Is there a state of nature in Scripture? In calling it the state of nature, Locke is quietly putting aside that whole biblical account of how God provided for man's needs. The biblical account only requires that man be obedient, and he will enjoy all the good things that he can imagine. Though, obviously, Adam and Eve didn't imagine very much, but there it is. Locke's account is that in the beginning, there was not plenty. There was penury. We had very little. Look at the way we come into the world. We don't have claws. We don't have a fur coat. We don't have fangs. And when a baby is born in the world, it takes years till it's even able to rummage around for itself. So man is born needy in a world that doesn't really give him much without his labor. It gives him air and in most places water. Everything else he has to work for. And given the incapacity of the newborn, this already creates a situation where some kind of social interaction is required in order for the individual human being to survive. He needs the help of others. If he has to provide everything on his own, he will provide very few things for himself. Basic subsistence or subsubsistence. So there's a need to move from the state of nature, however peaceful it might be, as Locke suggests it might be. It doesn't meet our needs. We've got to do more, and that more requires that we be on some terms of mutual understanding with our fellow. If you think of the beginning of the movie 2001, these semi-apes, semi-human beings being brought together through fear of an enemy or what have you. I mean, all of these are reminders on Lockean terms of how much man has to do for himself. And that leads to very far-reaching aspirations that we can shape and reshape our world according to our notions of what we want to have and how we want to live. So it's no longer a gift from God, which we accept gratefully, prayerfully, and all that, but rather seeing ourselves as having opportunities for making a world in which we can not only survive and live, but live comfortably. That introduces a whole new dynamic in political and economic life.
How important is the concept of property to Locke, and what's its relationship to liberty?
Locke's most significant discussion of rights and liberty are in a chapter in the second treatise titled Of Property. The fundamental property in Locke's system is our ownership, no, not our, my ownership of my body and your ownership of your body. When my fist crosses your epidermis, that's a profound act of trespass. Okay? Separate. Okay. You've got to respect that. From that primordial ownership, they can't take that away from me. I can't take that away from you. Everything else follows for Locke. There's a certain amount of sleight of hand, but it's extended. Not only do I own my body, but I own that which I do with my body, my labor, which doesn't mean I can't sell it or put it out for hire and all that, but fundamentally I've got to consent to it. So the whole notion of property comes out of civil society. That's to say, before we have civil society, in Locke's state of nature, I might have possession of something. If I find an apple on a tree and I take it down, okay, there's my labor going, okay, I've removed that apple from its twig and I start eating it. That's mine. And what I do with my labor is mine. But what if a bigger guy comes around and says, I see you holding that apple, or I see you've got extra apples, which I want, I need, and you have saved me this terrific labor of going around looking for apples. How secure am I in my enjoyment of that which I've mixed my labor in? The answer is not very. If I'm bigger than this other fellow, he'll think better of coming around trying to take my apples. But if he's bigger than I am, he can take my apples. And in fact, he can take everything. He can take my life. So, although I might have possession, according to the law of nature, in the state of nature, of my body and of that which I've mixed my body's labor in, my enjoyment of it is highly insecure. And that's one of the main things driving people, individuals, according to Locke, from the state of nature into civil society. Let's agree on some ground rules whereby I don't have to worry all night that you're going to come in there and take what's mine. I'll have confidence that there's a society, that there's an impartial judge, that there's a policeman on the beat. so that I can enjoy what's mine, and you can enjoy what's yours. But now it's a whole new ballgame. Now it's civil society with rules and police and government and taxes, the whole 9 yards. I have no notion why Jefferson changed Locke's triad from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It wasn't that Jefferson was indifferent to property. He owned a lot of it and cared about it and enjoyed it. But you might say the pursuit of happiness already presupposes property or something like it. Not only the proprietorship of one's body and of one's labor, but also the notion that you're not a pauper or a beggar or dependent on the kindness of others. Franklin, who is marvelous on these things, has a saying in Poor Richard's Almanac: an empty sack can't stand upright. It's true. How do you maintain your individuality or your rights or your right to have a say, to speak your mind, if you're simply dependent on others? You're not your own man. It doesn't mean that you might not rant, but can you speak with a sense that you have self-respect and you deserve respect from others? If you're simply a pauper. And I think the pursuit of happiness already presupposes a society of human beings. It doesn't mean that they're all equal economically or anything like that. Far from it. But who can stand up and have a voice and be regarded as a part of the society, a contributing member of a society, who deserves to be heard and then voted up or voted down. That's another issue. But one of us, somebody who has a stake in this society. So the substitution of pursuit of happiness for property may not be as great as it seems on the surface. That's my hunch.
When the founders talk about liberty, they almost always talk about virtue in the same breath. Why were the founders so concerned about virtue, and how did they understand it?
Yeah, today almost nobody talks about virtue. You know, I mean, if you wrote a letter of recommendation for a student and you said of this young woman that she's virtuous, it's almost certain to be misunderstood. Okay, people think you're talking about chastity or something like that. 18th century discussions of virtue owe a very great deal to Montesquieu, who wrote in the middle of the 18th century, The Spirit of Laws. And he speaks of the different forms of government and the different principles that underlie them. In a republic, in a monarchy, the principle would be honor, and an aristocracy, wealth, and in a republic, virtue. Meaning what? Meaning a populace, a general population, that sees itself as bound to exercise positive characteristics of being an active citizen in a body politic. The Roman Republic, let's say, very often held up as a model, where the citizen body are not silent observers of something going on that the big guys are doing, but where they themselves are participating and involved and feel themselves accountable for and accountable to. So that he calls virtue, political virtue, the virtue of an active citizen who cares and is involved. No passivity there. So then the question is, when the founders or the generation that talked about this in the 18th century, when they're talking about virtue, they're talking about a participatory government, not necessarily a democracy, but where the people at large think that what matters in matters of government ought to and does in fact matter to them personally. They're involved, they care, and they're not so preoccupied with earning a living or taking care of their private business as to preclude their focus on the public life that they share together. That's a very high standard. That's a very high standard.
Could you say something about Jefferson and that acute concern of his that rights we'll forget them, they'll run through our fingers, we'll lose them somehow?
Jefferson is not alone in regarding this new system, the United States of America, this kind of federal republic with Constitution and all that. He's very far from regarding it as a sure thing. It's an experiment to begin with, because there is no history of successful republics. All the republics that have been, going back to ancient Greece, and even the Italian medieval city-states, and even in their own way the Swiss confederations, they're failures. Either more powerful neighbors ran over them, or they consumed themselves in endless civil wars. Hamilton in the Federalist Papers speaks of them as wretched nurseries of faction and discord, a gloomy picture. So it becomes a question whether this thing can go, or whether it's just going to be another sad chapter, as though anyone needed more such chapters, of the people's failure to sustain popular self-governance. Jefferson, despite his optimism about a lot of things, is quite gloomy toward the end of the Revolutionary War. He thinks the people of America will grow comfortable, sleepy, fat, indolent, careless of the public business, and be completely preoccupied with their private good. I have my private good, you have your private good. It's a wonderful country. It lets us work on our own private good. Who's tending the store? Given the presupposition that people are power hungry, and Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, they all take that for granted. ambition and the love of power. If nobody's watching, if nobody's checking, someone's going to run away with the store. And it can be in a variety of ways. It can be through demagoguery, singing lullabies to the people, and they vote these same guys in, and then go back to their own drowsy business. Or it can be through terrible civil war. We have plenty of instances of civil wars over who shall rule. So it requires active, preemptive measures to forestall, forfend, at least for a while, the natural tendency of things to unwind. So in the case of Jefferson, he thinks we're just going to get involved with getting rich. Not that he didn't enjoy being rich. But we'll forget about this other business. We'll privatize our lives to such an extent that we won't be able to sustain the conditions that make us a self-governing people. So, doesn't look so good. That's why he says, let's get a Bill of Rights, let's secure these rights, religious liberty, education, and so on. Now, while we still have some public opinion that's filled with the spirit of liberty, because after a while, we'll forget. And if we don't nail this in place, if we don't secure this in place, now we run the risk of losing it all. That's Jefferson the optimist.
Is the Declaration of Independence foundational, or the foundation of American political life?
The position of the Declaration of Independence in our world today is essentially the product of Abraham Lincoln. Because after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the 1850s, what he regarded as the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, the prospect that now slavery could expand anywhere in the Western territories. And why limit it to the Western territories? There's Mexico waiting for us to take it over. There's Cuba, just a few miles off Florida. We could move into those countries. And since they're not of English descent, obviously they're not fit to enjoy English liberties, so we'll extend it. Slavery, peonage, whatever you will. And we can live happily ever after off other people's backs. And Lincoln said, no, you can't do that without losing the country that you claim you know and love. If I want tyranny, he says, or despotism, then rather than live in the US with the subterfuge that we think we enjoy liberty, but in fact give it the lie in our actions, rather than live here, I'd rather go to Russia where I can take my despotism straight. The real thing. So he re-energizes a people, not all of them to be sure, but a significant number of them, to think that if we want to be true to America, we have to be true to the America that was, the America that we can take pride in, not an America that doesn't care whether slavery is voted up or voted down. That legacy, reinforced, of course, by a terrible, terrible war, horrendous casualties, and all that, I think sort of secured the position of the Declaration today as still a point of reference. Lincoln asked these immigrants in Illinois when he was running for the Senate unsuccessfully, mainly Germans and Irish in Chicago. I understand you're going to celebrate the 4th of July. Whatever for? You're not British. You weren't here when. If you believe that the Declaration of Independence is, as Senator Douglas maintained it was, having to do with the rights of Englishmen then living in America, it's got nothing to do with you immigrants. But he said, that's not true. The people who came here, when they come here, these immigrants, they can speak of these founders or founding fathers, whatever you want, as though they're blood of the same people. They see the doctrines that were put forth in the Declaration as capacious enough to include all of us, all of them. That's a really heightened explanation of the Declaration. And I think if one went to a naturalization ceremony today in some courthouse where all sorts of people from all over the world raising their hands and swearing loyalty to the United States, you'd see that spirit.
Why did Jefferson repeatedly emphasize the deep and intimate connection between preserving liberty and education?
You can't enjoy liberty without having some sort of cultivated intelligence. This is a repeated theme with the founders. That's why they were interested in public schooling, why they tried where they could to found or support new universities, why they wanted compulsory public education down to the smallest unit of governance, where they wanted people engaged in taking care of their school districts, involved, not something that somebody produces for you, but something that you produce and support on your own. That's all part of the equipment, the mental outlook that we bring to being citizens in the emphatic sense. To the extent that we hire other people to do these things for us, we lose something powerful. You don't farm out or outsource something that's truly important to you. I mean, think of it in terms of our own lives as individuals. What really matters to us, we work on.
When you teach the Declaration, what do you find is the most effective, the most fruitful way to do it? What do you find that really engages students most? What's your object in trying to elicit a certain kind of engagement from your student?
Well, it's very hard to teach the Declaration, just as it's very hard to teach the Gettysburg Address. The sheer familiarity of it means you have a lot of trouble seeing it. I mean, to look at things like that with fresh eyes. Of course, things are much simpler if students haven't ever even encountered the Declaration of Independence. That's, I'm being sarcastic. But not to read our presuppositions into their arguments, to appreciate, to quote an old truism, that the past is a foreign country. We can't simply import our questions and our presuppositions into their minds. And yet, the document presents itself as eternally and universally valid. So, what are the issues being stirred there? Can we see these as problematic, even in our times? What it means to assert natural rights, what it means to assert equality of a certain sort, how you come to terms with manifest inequalities in life, with the different equipment that we bring to life. All these raise powerful issues. And uttering a formula doesn't resolve them. We got to think our way through them as best we can. And having thought through it once, it's not a bad idea to try to think through it twice.
This has been a Jack Miller Center digital media production. For more information about the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History, visit www.jackmillercenter.org.